The Skaven roster feels like one of the most bloated in the game, and as such has units for seemingly any situation. Their vast technological knowledge offers them some of the most powerful units in the game, particularly when it comes to ranged and some war machines. All of this doesn't come for free, as the rats are total cowards after all, so a lot of the time will literally turn tail and run for the hills if things aren't going their way. Let's first go over the pros and cons of the roster overall. As I mentioned, they have possibly the most technologically advanced roster in the game, with weapons teams and artillery rivaling that of even the Dowie. They also have extremely powerful monsters for pretty much any occasion, so whether you need some speedy backlines killers or a fat frontlines damage dealer, you're sorted. And finally, they may not have the largest selection of different magical laws, but the ones they do have are pretty damn powerful. As for the cons, their leadership across the board is pretty poor, so most battles you're going to be hopping back and forth between units, giving them orders to get back into combat once they stop running. All those juicy range units are all pathetic in melee combat, so if they get flanked or the front lines disappear and they get swarmed, they aren't going to be able to do much to defend themselves. And they also don't have many great ways to flank enemies or take out backlines. They have a couple of monsters and war machines later on, but aside from the wolves early on, they don't really have anything that's clear cut for just this job. Now let's get into the roster. First up we have the Lords, and first up we have Kweek Headtaker. He's armoured and deals armour-piercing anti-infantry damage, and is also an excellent duelist. Kweek is the frontlines battling specialist of the legendary lords. He's ridiculously tough with his high armour and excellent melee stats, meaning he can keep units busy for a very long time. He also has great armour-piercing damage with that bonus versus infantry. This also makes him an excellent duelist as he excels versus enemy lords and heroes with those melee stats and high damage. Send him into your front lines to provide some power and support, and target whatever man-sized target is the highest threat, and he'll do his part to take it down. Next up we have Lord Skrulk. He's primarily a spellcaster, but is equipped with a Plague Sensor, which grants him magical attacks and -10 leadership on any target hit. He's a decent melee combatant and comes with Frenzy, and has access to the Skaven spells of Plague. Skrulk is of course first and foremost a spellcaster with his spells of Plague, and wants to use this to deal damage and assist his army wherever he can whenever he has the winds to do it. On top of this, he's also quite a decent fighter with relatively high melee stats and nice damage, albeit not super duper armor piercing. You want to throw him into some combat versus units with low armor and damage and watch him do some great work with his sensor, all the while casting any spells that you like. Just don't let him get too focused down by other characters or high damage, and he should be just fine. Next up we have Ikkel. He's a spellcaster, is armoured, and deals armour-piercing anti-large damage. He has access to the Skaven spells of Ruin. Ikkel is an excellent fighter in pretty much every aspect. He has the stupidly powerful spells of Ruin, so can spam Warp Lightning like a madman, as long as he keeps the winds flowing. He's an excellent melee fighter with great armour, melee stats, and armour-piercing, flaming, magical, and anti-large damage. And he has a short-range missile attack that does some horrific damage to wherever it hits. All this adds up to a lord that you can't really use wrong. Let him rain death with his ranged attacks before moving into melee combat, all the while spamming Warp Lightning or whatever spells you really want. He also has access to 2 mounts. Doomflare loses his ranged attack, some melee stats, flaming, magical, and anti-large damage to gain speed, charge bonus, and anti-infantry damage. This of course makes him into sort of a pseudo-chariot of a lord. Or the Doomwheel, even worse melee stats than the Doomflare, as well as a little less charge bonus to gain a chunk of weapon damage and some great armor-piercing magical ranged damage back. It does become quite a large target though for range, so keep him on the move. Next up we have Treach Craventail. He's armoured and deals anti-large damage, and is allegedly a melee expert with charge reflect versus large, as well as vanguard deployment. Treach is in my opinion the most bland of the legendary lords. Yes, he's tough with his armour and impressive defense stats, but aside from that he doesn't really have much going for him. His attack is mid and his damage is decent, but has a lack of armour piercing, which kneecaps any massive effectiveness he'll have in the late game. His anti-large damage will make him okay versus bigger targets, as long as they don't have any armour, but his small size and lack of a mount will again hold him back from being super effective. Just get him into the front lines versus whatever doesn't have a lot of armour, and he should do well, and at least not take a lot of hits while he's there. Next we have Deathmaster Snitch. He has a Weeping Blade which causes minus 50% armour of whatever target he hits, scaling damage which means the higher the target's HP that he's attacking, the more damage he does, Stalk, Dodge which is 30% physical resistance, and Vanguard deployment. Snitch is of course the single target killer of the legendary lords. His speed and sneakiness make it easy for him to close the gap between him and his targets unnoticed. Once he's up close and personal, his amazing melee stats and high damage will ensure his targets go down very quickly. He may not have the thickest armour, but his high defense and physical resistance will make him deceptively hard to kill. Still, you'll want to keep him safe from being totally surrounded and let him take out those single targets in peace before slinking back into the shadows to scope out his next quarry. And our final legendary lord is Throttle the Unclean. He deals armor-piercing anti-large damage and has regeneration. He also has the Beast Pack ability, which allows him to summon a unit of rat ogres, and the Master Controller passive, which buffs all nearby units in combat. As you can see from his class, Throttle is more of a support lord than an outright fighter. Once he has all of his abilities and items, he can buff monsters in his army in a variety of ways to squeeze every last drop of potential out of them. Aside from this, he's still a halfway decent battler. He's not the toughest with medium armor, but that little bit of physical resistance combined with his defense makes him not the easiest to take out. His damage is pretty nice too with that armor piercing and anti-large, so he'll do well in the front lines versus either infantry or armored cav and monsters. Throw him into the middle of combat with as many of your monsters as you can to toss out buffs whenever needed and get in some great value for himself. As long as he doesn't get totally swamped, he should be just fine versus medium damage. He also has access to the Brood Horror mount, which gains a huge amount of speed, damage, charge bonus and poison attacks, and can now cause terror but is quite a large target. First of our generic lords is the Humble Warlord. These guys are armed and shielded, and they're your basic frontlines lord for the Skaven. They're pretty tough with heavy armor and decent melee stats, and they do okay damage with their weapon strength and attack. Sadly, this damage isn't the most armor piercing in the world, so versus high armor targets they will start to drop off in terms of effectiveness. Keep them deep in the front lines in the early game when their damage will punch through, then choose them less armored foes as the campaign goes on to ensure they remain effective. They also have access to a couple of mounts. The Bonebreaker, which loses some armor and the shield to gain speed, armor piercing damage and charge bonus, or the Brood Horror. Next up we have the Greyshears, and these guys are exclusively spellcasters, and they can come with these Skaven spells of Plague or the Skaven spells of Ruin. These are the basic spellcasters of the rats, and they want to cast spells to support your army, and honestly, that's pretty much it. They don't have the armor to be tough or the damage to be fighters, so unless they're going against Skaven slaves or something just as weak, keep them as support and do not send them in. Both their laws are great for raining destruction onto the battlefield, so even though they can't fight directly, they'll still get tons of damage and value from the safety of the back lines. They also have access to one mount, the Screaming Bell. This gains them armor, leadership and speed while losing overall weapon strength, but making more armor piercing. They also have a Bound Scorch spell which comes out from the mount itself, as well as the Unholy Clamour and Wall of Unholy Sound abilities. Next up we have the Warplock Masters. These guys are spellcasters and are armored and deal armor piercing anti-infantry damage, and of course come with the Skaven spells of Ruin. These are very similar to Ikkel, but with just a few differences. Overall, their stats are a little bit worse across the board, they have no range, and they swap the anti-large for anti-infantry. This does not massively change how you want to use them, aside from the fact they now want to get straight into melee and focus on infantry units while they're there. Still rain down death with the spells the entire time and still enjoy massive damage output alongside excellent toughness for one extremely powerful lord. They also have access to two mounts, the Doomflare and the Doom Wheel. And our final lord type are the Master Assassins. These guys come with Vanguard deployments, are duelists, master ambushers, have dodge, stalk, and can fire whilst moving. Just like the engineers are mini Ikkits, these guys are of course mini Snitch. They're excellent at sneaking up on enemies and focusing down one target with massively high damage. They of course don't have stats quite as powerful as Deathmaster himself, but still plenty for taking down most generic lords and heroes one-on-one. They also have an added ranged weapon which allows them to chip down enemies from afar before getting into combat, or kite them while dealing respectable damage from a safe distance. Whichever it is, just make sure they don't get surrounded, otherwise their assassination mission may go sideways real fast. Coming to the heroes now, first up we have our only legendary hero, and that's Gorage. He's armoured and deals armour piercing anti-infantry damage, and obviously causes terror. Just look at him. Gorage is equal parts amazing and horrifying to witness in combat. He's a massive hulking brute that charges headlong into enemies and deals insane damage every step of the way with that excellent attack, weapon strength and even charge bonus. However, he's a massive target for ranged and melee, and with 70 armor, he's not the most protected thing in the world, so needs to be careful about getting focused down and taken out. Throw him into the front lines versus the highest threat infantry you can find and watch him tear them to pieces. Just make sure to take out enemy ranged or high damage anti-large and he should do just fine. Next up we have Assassins. These come with Vanguard deployments, Stalk, Dodge and excellent duelists. These are an even weaker version of the Master Assassins, which are of course weaker versions of Snitch, so these are like the Charmander to Deathmaster's Charizard. It's another stat reduction across the board, including them losing a good chunk of armor piercing damage. This means they're not the best versus more armored characters, so their viable target pool grows ever smaller. I would send them in to take out any targets you can find with low armor, but if the enemy has none, then have them assist more armor piercing units in taking tougher targets down. They'll still be able to do some decent work even if it's part of a group. Just don't let them get surrounded, as these will truly melt if they get caught out. Next up we have the Plague Priest. These guys have Plague Sensors, are spellcasters, deal armor piercing damage and have Frenzy, and of course the Skaven spells of Plague. These are, again, like a smaller version of the Greyshears, but they actually gain a few stats. They have much better damage thanks to their sensor bearers, making them into decent frontlines heroes alongside powerful casters. They still aren't very tough, so you'll want to choose tags that are high armor but low damage to ensure they're dealing great damage without taking too much. Of course, have them toss out their spells as often as they can to keep up the support elsewhere, and pull them out if they start to take too much damage. Not worth losing the caster for the sake of a couple swings. They also have access to one mount, the Plague Furnace. This gains them armor, leadership and speed while losing melee stats and overall weapon strength but making it more armor piercing. It also grants them Pestilent Breath, which comes out from the middle of the mount itself, as well as the Billowing Death ability. Next up we have the Warplock Engineers. These guys are spellcasters and deal armor piercing damage and have access to the Skaven spells of Ruin. Back at it again with some repetition, these are basically smaller versions of the Warplock Masters. They have worse stats across the board, and don't hit nearly as hard or last nearly as long in melee combat. You want to use them pretty much the same though, so get them stuck into combat versus something with high armor but low damage to make them the most of their damage, but ensure they don't take too much too quickly. Keep up with the casting with the spells of ruin, and pull them out from combat if they start to take too much heat. Repeat myself here, it's not going to go much deeper. Next we have the Packmasters. These guys deal anti-large damage and also have charge reflect versus large. These are kind of similar to Throttle since they are a support specialist focused on helping out monsters in your army. You want to keep them as close to these units as possible to ensure they are being buffed and assisted wherever needed. Outside of that, they have okay damage and pretty poor survivability, so going against anything with even a bit of damage is going to be a no-go. Keep them fighting the weakest and least armored foes you can find, and as long as it's close to your monsters, they should do just fine. As long as they keep their buffs flowing, they're doing their part. They also have access to one mount, the Brood Horror. Next we have the Chieftains. These are armored and deal armor-piercing anti-large damage. These are quite a unique hero, since they are basically meant to be a Lord replacement when your Lord is injured, running, or otherwise unavailable. They keep nearby units encouraged as well as doing some decent work themselves. They're pretty tough with their armor and defense and do nice damage with their attack and weapon strength. The bonus versus large can also make them a little bit more effective versus larger foes, but I won't focus on this too hard when searching for a target. Get them into the middle of your front lines against some decent enemy infantry and they should do pretty great. As long as they don't get surrounded by high armor piercing damage, they should be just fine. They also have access to one mount, the Bonebreaker. And our final heroes are the Echin Sorcerers. These are spellcasters, come with Vanguard deployment and Stalk, and have access to the Skaven spells of stealth. These guys are pretty comparable in stats to the Plague Priests, but without the sensors, so less damage and no contact effects. What they lack in damage, they make up for with sneakiness, with their ability to go up nice and close to enemies before they even see you coming. How can you use this to your advantage when being a spellcaster? I don't know, but you can do it. Keep them safe on the backs and the flanks, and use their spells to support your army wherever needed. Of course, their spells work well with stealth units, so if you want to hide a big flank, then go right ahead, and send them around with it for good measure. First of our melee infantry, and it's of course the Skaven slaves. These are a tier 1 unit, as well as an expendable meat shield with poor leadership. These of course aren't going to win the awards for world's best infantry units, and they likely aren't going to win in combat versus pretty much anything either. They are as pure a meat shield as they come, and they don't pretend to be anything else. They are simply there to eat missiles, cav charges, and anything else that happens in the early stages of combat. They want to do this to protect your units behind them, which are likely more damaging and much more valuable. If by some miracle they make it to the front lines, then unless they're going against some zombies with 12 HP, they're going to need support in any way you can provide it, so missiles, monsters, and magic are all on the table. And if you're worried about hitting them with spells, just remember how bloody cheap they are, and how they take one turn to recruit basically anywhere on the map. We also have another variation, the Skaven Slave Spears. These are also a tier 1 unit, but now come with anti-large damage. Honestly, they are functionally the same as base Skaven Slaves. The only changes they have is less attack, more defense, and a bonus versus large. Not that it's going to change anything. I like to grab them since the extremely minor defense increases will make them last 2 seconds instead of 1 in combat, but honestly they are still pitifully weak, so you can go for whichever you fancy. Next we have the Clan Rats. These are also a tier 1 and are also a meat shield. These are still pretty weak, but rather than being slaves forced to fight, these are your everyday Skaven conscripts. They are still pretty squishy and have poor melee stats for both attack and defense, with mediocre damage and pretty poor leadership. Still, in the early game they'll be able to beat slaves and other chaff and hold the line for a little while against anything a little better. Of course, they'll do best with support from other units, so give them plenty of that once they make contact and absorb any initial charges. They also have another variation, the Clan Rat Spears. These now gain anti-large damage as well as charge defense versus large. Similar to slaves, they lose some attack and weapon strength to gain some defense and anti-large bonus damage. They now also receive that charge reflection versus large, so we'll be able to take a charge and keep coming back. It still doesn't really change how you want to use them, since they're still a weak meat shield and need support from other units to get any kills. I like the extra defense, so I like to have these guys as my front line early on if I can afford the small price hike, but the difference is pretty minor if you can't. We also have a couple of variations for both the Clan Rats. Shielded Clan Rats, which of course gain shields. Literally the same as Clan Rats, but they have a bronze shield and 4 more defense. Not going to go over them again since they work pretty much the same, but these guys are worth a minor price increase for that missile early game toughness. And the shielded Clan Rat Spears, which wouldn't you know it, also have shields. Exactly the same as the regular shields, they gain the bronze shield and 4 defense. Use them the same, but now enjoy not falling over if they even see an archer unit. Next up we have the Warp Grinders. These are a tier 2 unit and deal armor piercing damage, can attack walls, and come with Vanguard deployment. Now these are a super weird unit and are extremely situational. Initially they look okay with high armor and damage for an early game unit, but then you see it. The melee stats are just so bad. Unless you're playing as Ikkel and you have the Forbidden Workshop, these guys will never be a viable frontlines unit, but that's just fine as they are much better at 2 things. Their ability to attack walls is unmatched by any other unit. If you get them into attack, they will make short work and give your units an opening to pour through in no time. Their other power lies in their 2 abilities. These allow them to stop enemies in their tracks and literally stop them from moving for a short time. They can also cause damage in the same area and slow enemies, so if you time it right, you can keep enemies in the same place for a very long time and get some decent damage while they're there. If you combine this with ranged and magical power of the Skaven, you can wipe entire units in this time. Are they situational? Absolutely. But when they're in their elements, they do pretty well. Next up, we have the Echin Triads. These are a tier 3 unit, have Weeping Blades, which of course grants minus 50% armor upon hit, and deal armor piercing anti-large damage, come with Stalk, charge reflection versus large, and have the Concealment Bombs ability that grants them stalk and unspottable for a short time. These are another weird unit, but I have a harder time justifying these lads. They're a spears unit with anti-large damage and charge reflection, but they also have stalk. Are they meant to be used to protect your missile units and stay hidden to bait an early rush? Or are they meant to be used as sneaky flankers to get around the enemy and sandwich their front lines? I mean, you can do either, but honestly, I never take them since they just don't really fit with the rat playstyle, and they're just not worth it. If you're playing a Snitch and they're the only front line that won't bankrupt you, then by all means go right ahead. But if you're not, you can give these guys a miss most of the time. Next up we have Deathrunners. These are a tier 2 unit, have Weeping Blade, Stalk, Concealment Bombs, and Dodge. These lads are another niche unit, but they're actually pretty good. They're speedy, sneaky stabbers that want to get around the enemy lines and attack their key targets from an unexpected angle. Their high damage and armor reduction will allow them to wipe out armored forces with ease, especially if they're sandwiching the front lines. They aren't the toughest units in the world, but their physical resistance will save them against anything without magical damage. Either send them to sandwich front lines or take out tougher back lines. Just keep them hidden and don't let them get surrounded, and they'll do just fine. Next up we have Plague Monks. These are a tier 2 unit, deal anti-infantry damage, and are frenzied damage dealers. These are the chaff shredding infantry of the Skaven lines. They may not have the most armor piercing damage in the world, but versus less armored infantry, they slap and slap pretty hard with their high weapon strength and respectable melee stats. They are pretty squishy with no armor, and even that physical resistance will only get them so far. Once enemies are starting to sling back even a moderate amount of damage, they will start to fall pretty hard. Keep them against low armor targets and swap out once enemy armies are getting more full of tough guys. They also come in another variation, the Plague Monk Sensor Bearers. These are a tier 3 unit and now come with plague sensors, which grant them magical attacks and -10 leadership upon hit. This of course also grants them armor piercing damage, and they are still frenzied damage dealers. The sensors grant them that huge amount of damage, including armor piercing and magical, allowing them to take on units with high armor or resistance with ease. They're still pretty squishy themselves, so chances are they'll take as much damage as they give, but they'll still be slinging out damage all the way into the endgame. You can have these guys your entire front line in the endgame if you want, and they'll do great damage, but also be pretty easy to take out. Give them some support with other units to take out their targets faster, and save them taking some damage. Next we have the halberd Storm Vermin. These are a tier 3 unit, are armored, deal armor piercing anti-large damage, and have charge reflection versus large. These are what I like to take into the endgame, because they're just so damn tough on top of doing some pretty hot damage. Their massive armor and decent defense make them great line holders, especially combined with the charge reflection. Their armor piercing and anti-large damage allow them to take out pretty much anything that isn't relying on resistance with relative ease, and they're just such an all-around great unit that you can't go wrong with the front line of them. Of course, sling some monsters and missiles their way to help them out against particularly tough units, but other than that, just set them and forget them. They also have another variation, and that's our final infantry unit, that is the Sword and Shield Storm Vermin. These are still tier 3 units and are now armored and shielded. These guys swap the armor piercing anti-large damage for a bronze shield and improvements to melee stats. This makes them better line holders so long as they aren't battling against anything large that can charge straight through them. Of course, the loss of armor piercing means they're going to struggle to do as much damage, especially later into the game, so we'll have to rely on monsters, magical missiles, a lot more to do the damage. If you don't mind babysitting them to deal any damage, then they will hold the line better versus other infantry. But for me, the lack of any meaningful damage this late into the game just isn't enough to bring them, so I stick to halberds. Now comes to the ranged infantry. First up we have the Skaven Slave Slingers. These are a tier 1 unit, an expendable meat shield, and have poor leadership. These are your super early game range troops, but of course, since they're slaves, they're pretty poor. They have literally 0 armor and terrible melee stats, so if anything, and I mean anything, finds them and pulls them into melee combat, they will break or die in seconds. Their range damage isn't really much better since it's so pitifully low and won't get through even the most mediocre amounts of armor, so it'll be tickling most units that aren't other slaves. For how cheap they are and easy to recruit early on, they're okay to take a few off to focus fire enemies and give your front line some illusion of support, but once you can get literally anything better, you should, since that meat shield belongs on the front lines, not the back. Next we have Nightrunners. These are a tier 1 unit, decent melee combatants, have vanguard deployment, can fire whilst moving, and come with dodge. These are quite a big step up as they now have a bit more damage, as well as some okay prowess in melee combat. First of all, their range damage has a much shorter range, but they can fire whilst moving to make for some excellent skirmish troops that can kite most infantry, just make sure to keep them safe from cav and warhounds. They're pretty squishy, but the resistance does make them decently tough against low non-magical damage, and allows them to do okay in melee versus some weaker units. Just keep them on the move to flank the enemy and fire into their backs and sides of the front lines, whilst avoiding enemy missiles or being caught out. Toss them into melee versus anything super weak like enemy back lines, but don't let them get caught out by any real fighting units, as they simply will not last. They also come in another variation, the Sling Nightrunners. These are a tier 1 unit, decent melee combatants, vanguard deployment, and come with dodge. They lose some missile strength and the ability to fire on the move to gain much more ammo and range. This changes them into a stationary backlines unit that want to be used to fire over the heads of your units into the front lines to provide support. They can still move around to get a better angle, but their increased range just means that this isn't a total necessity. Get them a decent enough angle and let them fire away on less armored troops to allow the low damage to actually be felt. Their melee stats still don't change, so if something aggressively weak stumbles by, then by all means send them in to take them out. But most of the time, keep them at a range to get the most value. Next up, we have Warp Fire Throwers. These guys are a tier 1 unit, and of course, throw Warp Fire, which deals fire and magical damage, and causes -8 leadership upon contact. They're also armored, deal anti-infantry damage, and are of course damage dealers. These are the first of the weapons team's ranged troops and naturally are a big step up in terms of damage. They can literally melt entire units in a single barrage if they get the angle right. Their missiles do massive damage and will cut through any resistance with that magical. Their short range does however mean they need to get quite close to their target, so moving them in can be quite a risk, especially with their less than ideal melee stats. Their huge streams of fire will wipe most units out that come into contact, and that includes your own. So these are definitely units you either want to get a good angle on or prepared to commit some serious war crimes against your own troops. Get them around the sides of the enemy lines and let them rack up a ton of kills and damage on the enemy. Poison Wind Globadiers next up, and these are the first of the tier 2 units. These guys of course fire poison wind globes, which are magical missiles which apply poisoned wind upon contact. They're also armored, deal armor piercing anti-large damage. These are another high damage ranged unit, but instead of having high powered streams of warp fire piss, they toss globes of exploding poison that deal a ton of magical and armor piercing damage. You want to use these guys to target into the biggest clump you can find of tough units and rain fire. Not only will the projectiles do some great damage versus basically anything, the poison wind effect will cause damage over time to anything they hit, meaning even more value. They are still pretty defenseless in melee, so keep them safe from being charged or flanked, and they also have quite a short range, so we'll have to get close to their targets or flank the front lines to get a clear shot. So get them around the enemy lines or really close to your front lines, and let them loose versus the toughest infantry units you can find. Next up we have Gutter Runners. These are a tier 2 unit, come with Vanguard deployment, Stalk, Snare Net, which slows all nearby enemy units, and can fire whilst moving. These are more or less the direct upgrade to Nightrunners since they have the same speed and range, but improvements to pretty much every other stat. They also gain those snare nets, so anything that gets close to them will be slowed, which is super useful for keeping their distance when doing some skirmishing. Honestly, aside from that, you can use them pretty much the same as the Nightrunners, but now they'll just be better at every aspect. They'll do more damage with more ammo and be a little bit better in combat if they get caught out. Just keep them in skirmish mode and firing until they're out of ammo, then go for some weak targets to squeeze the final drops of value out of them. They also come with a poison variation. Literally the exact same as the base unit, but now they have poison attacks and ammo. Will perform the exact same but better, use them the exact same, not going to go over it again. They also have another variation, the Slinger Gutter Runners. These are a tier 2 unit, come with Vanguard deployment, Stalk, Snare Net, and Dodge, but cannot fire whilst moving. And of course, these are more or less the direct upgrade to Slinger Nightrunners. As such, they have the same differences from the base unit, gaining more range and ammo, whilst losing a little bit of damage, and the ability to fire whilst on the move. They want to be used as a standard backlines ranged unit to fire over your front line's heads and take out enemy units from much further away. Once the lines clash, they can either find an angle to fire from or move back around to flanks of the enemy for a clearer shot. They still have the same melee prowess, so feel free to send them in versus really weak foes, but of course focus on ranged with them before this, as this is really where they get the most done. And they also come with a Poison Slinger Gutter Runner variation. Literally, exact same as the base unit, but have poison attacks and ammo, perform the exact same, but with the poison debuff, use them the exact same. That's it. Next up we have Death Globe Bombardiers. These are a tier 2 unit and now throw Death Globes, which are meant to have a more powerful cloud effect, but they don't. Games in beta might get fixed at some point. They're also armored and deal armor piercing anti-infantry damage from a range. These are another direct upgrade from the Poison Wind Mortars. They have the same stats in everything aside from missile strength. They get a nice boost to their armor piercing damage, and as I said, they're meant to have that contact effect, but it appears it's not here just yet in the beta. Regardless, it should do more damage in a large area and hit more enemies with more damage over a longer period of time. They want to be used pretty much the same as the old unit. Get them a good angle due to their short range, and rain fire on the biggest clumps of enemies you can find to make the most of the explosions and contact effect. Keep them safe from melee combat as their pathetic stats mean even their armor can't save them from even moderate attackers. Do all this and avoid hitting any of your own important units, and they'll be doing great. Next we have Rattling Guns. These are a tier 3 units and deal armor piercing anti-infantry damage and are of course a damage dealer. They also have suppressing missiles which slow enemy movements when under fire. These guys are probably my favourite unit in the roster and one of my favourite units in the game based purely on concept alone. They're rats with miniguns. What more could you ever possibly need? They deal outstanding damage in a straight line with a barrage of armor-piercing missiles. They can shred infantry units, large targets, flyers, cav, and just about anything else you can think of, as long as they're in range and have a clear line of sight. Of course, their straight line firing makes them pretty poor once the lines clash, so you'll need to get them an angle to fire from to ensure they keep up the damage. Just keep them safe from any melee combat, as their poor stats will not keep them safe against even the weakest of attackers. Get them line of sight and firing, and they'll do God's work. Oh, and if you play Ikkel, grab infinite ammo to basically turn on cheats. Next we have the Warplock Engineers. These are a tier 3 unit, deal armor piercing missile damage, and have excellent range. They also have the shield breaker contact effect, which reduces the target's chances of blocking missiles. These are the crane guns from Cathay, but before they were cool. They have a massive range and can fire high damage projectiles with excellent precision. They deal massive amounts of armor piercing damage, and even cause units hit to be easier to hit with more missiles, so once they start landing shots, it's often hard to stop. I like to use them to target the biggest threats on the enemy force and soften them up right from the get-go. They don't have the raw damage output of rattlings, so taking out infantry is best left to them. These lads instead can do great work versus large entities and single targets, as all of those missiles landing on one or a few targets are going to sting quite a bit. Again, they need a straight line of sight to fire, so get them a decent angle, but if you're targeting large, this is made much easier since you can get away with firing over units' heads. Finally, they are another one that's insanely weak in melee combat, so keep them safe from any and all flanks as much as possible. They are actually decently tough versus some light range with their silver shields, but they should be far enough back that you don't really need to worry about that. Now our final ranged units are the poisoned wind mortars. These are a tier 3 unit, fire poison wind globes, and have excellent range. These are another insanely powerful unit for demolishing infantry clusters with ease. They are essentially artillery units that can move at decent speed all while dealing insane damage. Their massive range shots deal huge damage in large explosions that can shatter infantry clumps, HP and leadership in seconds no matter how much armor or resistance they have. Add the damage over time on top of this, and they can wipe whole armies out in just a few shots. They also have the one thing that rattlings and jazales both lack, a firing arc. Yes, these lads can do all of this damage from the safety of standing behind your front lines, so fire over their heads carefree. Of course, explosions of their missiles can and probably will hit your own troops, but that's a little better than flat out shooting them in the back. This also makes them amazing in sieges, so definitely bring some since there are a lot more of those lately. Now come to the monsters and beasts. First up we have the wolf rats. These are a tier 1 unit, deal armor piercing damage, are very fast and come with vanguard deployment. Much like every wolf unit, these lads are amazing at taking out backlines, especially if you send a couple in to surround a target. But these boys also have something that most hounds don't. Armor piercing damage, albeit just a little bit. This means they can actually do some decent damage versus slightly more armored targets, but they should still stick to backlines as their defense leaves a lot to be desired. Use them the same as any other hound, send them in twos to take out backlines units, then loop them back around to chase down anything retreating to rack them up a ton of kills. They also come in another variation, the poison wolf rats. These are a tier 1 units, are still very fast and have that vanguard deployment, but they now have poison attacks and a weak versus armor. These actually do have a couple of differences other than just gaining poison damage. They also lose their magical and armor piercing damage, so versus anything with resistance or some armor, they're going to struggle a lot more. They do gain weapon strength, but it's not armor piercing, so against tougher troops, they're going to be much worse off. Of course, the poison does help to make up for this, but I wouldn't totally trade over to these chaps. I'd probably go for a couple of each and pair them up with one regular and one poison to target single range troops. This ensures you have the damage as well as the poison effects, so we'll be able to take down targets just fine. Next we have rat ogres. These are a tier 2 unit, deal armor piercing damage and have frenzy. These are a great frontlines monster with their large frenzied area attacks and their decent armor piercing damage. Their multiple entities and size make it easy to embed them in the front lines and keep them safe while dealing this damage, and even means they are the easiest target in the world for missiles. Of course, they can be easily focused down if the enemy has a good firing angle or surrounds them with high damage or anti-large, so keep an eye out for that and pull them out if things start to look dicey. If you can keep them safe from both of these, they should get a ton of value. Next we have the Brood Horror. This is a tier 3 unit, deals armor piercing damage, and is extremely fast and causes terror. I'm honestly not sure how these things exist. They're obviously great battling monsters with crazy high damage and melee attack along with the armor piercing and poison damage. They aren't super tough with their large size and medium armor, but the regeneration helps a lot when you need to pull them out for a breather. But honestly, the part that makes these guys unbelievable to me is the stupid speed. Yes, you're reading that 95 correctly. They are literally as fast as wolf rats, so on the ground, there is basically nothing that can get away from them. This means you can easily send them sprinting around the map to take out all kinds of targets, from backlines artillery all the way to heavy infantry on the front. Their damage will cut through pretty much anything that isn't resistant, so choose whatever you want. As long as they don't get focused down by ranged or high damage anti-large infantry, they should do great work wherever you send them. Next we have the mutant rat ogre. These are another tier 3 unit, deal armor piercing anti-infantry damage, and have frenzy. These are pretty much what they say on the tin. They're a hot single rat ogre in your area and have some supercharged stats from their mutations. They have great melee stats and outstanding damage, both armor piercing and magical, allowing them to take out pretty much anything with ease. They also have quite a tasty charge bonus, so making contact of enemies will leave quite a dent before you even get into the sustained combat. Of course, they aren't the most armored, but they have plenty of HP and a sprinkling of missile resist. Still, I wouldn't leave them out in the open to be focused down by ranged or surrounded by anti-large damage. Otherwise, it's a lot of value going down the shitter. Avoid these two things and sling these boys into the front lines, and you'll get a bunch of value out of them versus nearly any front lines in the game. And our final monster is the Hellpit Abomination. This is a tier 3 unit, has the too horrible to die ability, which grants it a 50% chance to gain 20% HP regeneration upon dropping below 10% HP, and this can occur multiple times a battle. They also have armor piercing damage, cause terror because obviously, and have built-in regular regeneration. When it eventually does die, a unit of Skaven slave spears will spawn from the corpse. This is the endgame monster for the rats, and it is quite a sight to behold. This massive mess of a creature has some amazing damage with huge weapon strength and armor piercing and anti-large, as well as high melee attack and a healthy dose of area damage. Toss this into a clump of enemy units and they are going to have a very bad day, pretty much no matter what. Whether it's infantry or something bigger, they're going to slap and slap pretty damn hard. Of course, they're massive targets for enemy ranged, but thanks to their huge HP bar, it doesn't hugely matter. And once you take into account the regeneration, you can see they are extremely hard to get rid of. If they do manage to get low HP, they have that chance for a massive burst of regeneration to occur, making them much harder to finally get rid of, and if they do eventually fall, at least you'll get a unit of slaves to also die, because let's be honest, they're not going to do much else. Send them in versus the highest value clump you can find, and pull them out for regen when needed, and watch their damage value skyrocket. And our final category, the artillery and war machines. First up, the Plague Claw Catapult. This is a tier 2 unit, and has Plague Claw Contagion, which is magical ammo and the contaminated contact effect. They They also have armor-piercing missiles and deal anti-infantry damage. These are of course the anti-infantry artillery of the Skaven force. They have that huge range and can sling massive amounts of damage across it with ease to deal devastating damage to clumps of enemy infantry. Their damage is also armor-piercing and magical, so units with armor and resistance will feel the pain equally and be very beaten up by the time they reach your lines, if they ever do. Of course, keep these guys safe from any melee combat as they can't fight their way out of a wet paper bag, and have them focus on the biggest clump of enemy units that you can to make the most of those massive explosions. We also have the Warp Lightning Cannons. These are a tier 3 unit, have armor-piercing missiles and deal anti-large damage. While the Plague Claws are the anti-infantry artillery, these boys are the large target killers. They have an even more insane range, but now have to fire in a straight line to hit their targets. Lucky for them, large targets often stand tall above the rest, so they'll have no problem with this. Their massive damage has that bonus versus large and it's magical, so units with resistance or armor will be no problem, and just feel pain all the same. Just like catapults, keep them safe from melee combat, otherwise they are literally useless, and focus down large targets from the backlines to get some great value. We have the Doomflares. These are a tier 3 unit, are armored and deal armor-piercing anti-infantry damage. These are the chariot equivalent of the Skaven. They have a nice bit of mass, high speed, and a decent charge bonus combined with a pretty nice weapon damage. Their melee stats leave a little bit to be desired, so keep them on the move in and out of combat to make the most of their charge bonus and keep them safe from being pinned down and focus. Their high mass should help push them through most infantry, but just be careful of anti-large as they will quickly go down if bogged down in high damage troops. And our final unit is the Doom Wheel. This is a tier 3 unit and has Zap. The warp lightning rods on the side of the wheels automatically fire all around them for some powerful range damage. They're also armored and deal armor-piercing anti-infantry damage. The Doom Wheel is essentially a single, larger Doomflare, and as such gets a ton of buffs to pretty much everything. They are insanely tough with high armor and a good chunk of HP, their melee stats are still pretty poor, but they're super high mass and have a fat charge bonus and weapon strength, so will do amazing if kept on the move, charging in and out of combat. And finally, they have their passive ranged weaponry, which will fire as they move through enemies and get them even more value just for existing. Use them like chariots moving in and out of the enemy lines, focusing on their back lines to wipe them out first, before coming back to take on the backs of the front lines. We now come to the regiments of renown. I'll call out each regiment, what they're a unit of, and the differences between them and the base units of the same rank. The Clan Vulcan Tail Slashers are a shielded clan rats unit and gain flaming attacks, 20% fire resistance, and 8 weapon strength. Ikkel's Triads are echin triads units and gain the Doppelgang ability. The Viscatrin's Death Squad are Death Runners and gain the Duck and Weave ability. Blight Scab's Plague Pack are Censor Bearer Plague Monk units and gain the Rabble Rouse ability. The Council Guard are a halberd Storm Vermin unit and gain Unbreakable and the Guardian ability. Teethbreakers are rattling guns and gain the Concealment Bombs ability. Nazi Bubo's Sharpshooters are a Warplock Engineer unit and gain Snipe and Stalk. The Avalanche Mortars are Death Globe Mortar units and gain 318 missile strength. The Pit Fighters of Hell's Deep are Rat Ogres units and lose 1 melee attack but gain immune to Psychology and the Berserk ability. Moskitar's Hellion is a mutant Rat Ogre, loses 1 melee attack but gains the Zap infused melee attack, which increases cooldowns of the target's hit, as well as the Warp Discharge ability. The Thing is the Hell Pit Abomination and gains the Fluid Injection ability. Ikkit's Zap are Warp Lightning Cannons and gain the Zap Contact effect. The Dwarf Thing Menace are a Doomflares unit and gain armor sundering attacks and cause fear. And the Wheels of Doom are a Doom Wheel unit and gain 86 missile strength. Ikkit also has access to some unique regiments that are exclusive to him and his workshop. The Doombringers are a Warp Fire Throws unit and gain increases to HP, melee stats, and Unbreakable. The Death Dealers are Rattling Guns and gain increases to ammo, range, and weapon strength. Black Hole Flayers are Doomflares units and gain the Brass Orb ability. Eye Takers are Warplock Engineers, again the Blinded Contact effect on their missiles, and the Hawkish Precision ability. And Warpfire's Wheel is a Doom Wheel and gains a lot of HP and regeneration. Now comes to the army compositions. In Warhammer 3, every unit has a tier from 1 to 3. I'm going to be using these tiers to make you armies for the early, mid, and late game so that you are set for every single step of your campaign. First of all, tier 1, we're going to have a Warplock Master, 4 Skaven Slave Spears, 5 Shielded Clan Rat Spears, 3 Nightrunners, 3 Warp Fire Throwers, and 2 Wolf Rats, and 2 Poison Wolf Rats. The Warplock Masters are the best generic lore type for me, and it's not even a question. They have access to the Skaven spells of Plague and Clapper Ash Cheeks to another level, and the Great Fighters, and have access to amazing mounts later on. Obviously, the slaves are being brought in to keep the enemy still and either die in seconds from enemy damage or die in seconds from being bathed in holy warp fire. The Shielded Clan Rat Spears are the secondary line you want to bring in once the slaves are breaking, and they're going to be doing the actual line holding for your battles, so avoid burning them if you can, and they should do alright, but of course, bring them support as soon as possible. The Nightrunners are going to go and skirmish and run interference on the enemy back lines and draw their attention while doing some light missile damage, and the Warp Fire Throwers are obviously going to be your main damage at this stage, so keep them safe at all costs and have them rain death onto the enemy lines. And finally, the Wolf Rats are going to work in pairs to take out enemy backlines units, and then come back to finish off anything that was retreating to break the enemy and trigger army losses. Coming to tier 2, we're still leading with that Warplock Master, and we're picking up a Plague Priest and a Packmaster. Our front lines are now 6 Plague Monks, we're picking up 5 Death Globe Bombardiers, 4 Rat Ogres, and 2 Plague Claw Catapults. The Warplock Master should have all their spells and be on a mount by now to be a mobile, powerful spellcaster with some nice charging ability. Picking up a couple of heroes here, since the rats just have amazing options. The Plague Priest is going to bring that other amazing spellbook, so we'll get great value, and the Packmaster is coming for all the many buffs and monsters, which you get later on. The Plague Monks aren't the toughest, but they are the best front lines you can get at this stage, so we'll have to do. They still do great damage versus chaff, but need a lot of help versus armor and more damaging foes. The Death Globes may or may not have the raw dog wiping power of the Warp Fire Throwers, but they'll still do great area damage and likely do it with some less friendly fire. Still, keep them safe from melee combat, or you'll be losing a lot of your damage. The Rat Ogres are going to bolster the front lines with their damage to push through enemy forces as quickly as possible and expose more vulnerable units in the back. And finally, the Plague Claws are going to sit at the back of the enemy and sling tons of damage downfield into the biggest clumps you can target. Just be aware of flanks and they should be just fine. The only downside of this army comp is not the most choices for flanking units, so if you're going against a lot of ranged, you might take a lot of hits even if you still manage to grab the dub. And finally, we come to tier 3. Still have that Warplock Master, the Plague Priest and the Packmaster. Our front lines is now 6 halberd storm vermin, and for the ranged we're going to bring it 2 rattling guns, 2 Warplock Jezzails and 2 poisoned wind mortars. For our monsters, we're going to have a Brood Horror and 2 Hell Pit Abominations. We're going to close this out with 2 Doom Wheels. The Warplock Master should be in their final form of all their spells and a Doom Wheel mount, so be a fierce charger as well as a powerful mage. The Plague Priest should also have all their spells and be on a mount, so be beacons of plague and encouragement for the front lines. The Packmaster should be on their Brood Horror mounts and have plenty of buffs for monster units to work closely with them in combat. The front lines are now super tough while also doing some pretty great damage, so will hold most enemy lines back and give you plenty of time to plan their demise. The ranged line has something for every scenario, so whether you need long range snipers, area damage or a barrage of armor piercing, you are covered. Just keep them all safe from melee or any damage and they'll carry your battles. The Brood Horror is going to work with the Packmaster and either assist on the front lines or flank the enemy to get into their backs depending on what you need. The Abominations will be straight into the front lines to provide a ton of damage, just try not to shoot them too much yourself since they are massive targets. And finally, there's 2 Doom Wheels going to focus on flanking the enemy and taking out back lines with their high charging damage. That is everything you need to know on how to play these Skaven in battle. We've got the Vampire Coast campaign coming on Monday, so subscribe if you want to see that. Hoping to hit 50k by the end of the year, so I would appreciate the assistance. If you enjoyed this video and or found it useful, then consider dropping a like. If you really enjoy the content and want to support it directly, then consider becoming a member on YouTube, a patron on the Patreon. Doing so gets you early insights into future content, increased voting power and discounts on merch, as well as shoutouts at the end of every video, just like Henry Tucker for his support at the opposite tier. Massive thank you to all supporters, and one last thank you for watching, and for now, I've been COLONELDAMNEDERS, and I will see you next turn.